He's not barking. That's not normal. The old man's voice cracked the silence like a rusted nail splitting wood. Brenna didn't usually speak to animals, not even his own, but the silence had unsettled something in his gut. The kind of silence that didn't just mean quiet, it meant absence. The golden retriever stood in the doorway of the woodshed, unmoving, not wagging her tail, not pacing, just staring. Her coat, once honeyed and brushed smooth, was now darkened with dust and clumps of burrs from somewhere she shouldn't have been. Her eyes didn't plead. They ordered Annie, Brenna muttered, stepping closer. He reached for the brass handle of the shed, but the dog jerked sideways and walked off. No glance back, no invitation, just a slow, determined gait into the brittle brush and dying grass behind the property fence. Brenna hesitated. He was 78, nearly blind in his left eye, and still recovering from a winter that had locked half his bones in pain. But something about the way Annie moved the limp in her hind leg, the tension in her shoulders, it reached past logic. He grabbed his coat and followed. The path Annie carved through the field wasn't a path at all. It was memory, maybe instinct. She led him past the edge of his late wife's garden, now overgrown and filled with vines that twisted like fingers across broken stones. Beyond it, the land dropped, folding into an old creek bed that hadn't run in years. Brenna stumbled, boots catching in the hidden roots of the red oaks. His breath wheezed, his fingers curled stiffly around the branch he used as a cane. But Annie kept walking, pausing only once, where a fallen log lay snapped across the trail like something wounded. She didn't sniff it. She stared at it, like it had betrayed her. Then she ducked under the log and disappeared into a shadowed hollow of trees Brenna hadn't seen in decades. It had once been the property line, long before the newer homes and fences pushed inward. Now it was a forgotten pocket of earth, the kind of place kids once dared each other to explore and hunters passed through in silence. Brenna stepped through, and the smell hit him first. It wasn't death, not yet. It was metal and dampness, like rusted nails soaked in rainwater. And beneath it, something worse. Something like pain that had gone unanswered. Then he saw her. Not Annie. The mother dog had stopped at the edge of a thorn bush, her chest heaving, her head bowed. She didn't enter. She couldn't. Brenna parted the branches. The clearing was small. Sunlight barely touched it. And there, against the trunk of a split cedar, nailed crudely through her tiny forelegs, hung a golden retriever puppy no older than 10 weeks. Her fur had been dragged through something oil, maybe mud, maybe worse. Her eyes were still open, not crying, not blinking, just frozen wide in a stare that made Brenna's breath catch in his throat. He stumbled forward. "Dear God," he whispered. The puppy twitched. Just once, she was alive. His hands shook as he reached for her, torn between instinct and horror. The nails were crooked railroad spikes, hammered through soft joint. The blood had crusted black around the bark. And yet the pup didn't make a sound. Not one. Brenna had no tools, no blade, no phone. Annie whimpered behind him. The sound she'd made in hours. Brenna looked at the dog. And for the first time in years, something like rage curled in his chest. Not loud rage, not youthful, break the door down fury, but a slow, purposeful kind. The kind that came from too many years of silence and too many things lost. "I don't know who did this," he said hoarsely, voice barely more than gravel, "but they're going to regret waking me up." He pulled his belt free, wrapped it tightly around the base of the largest nail, and began to twist. The bark splintered, the pup's body trembled. The forest didn't make a sound. No birds, no breeze, only the sound of an old man freeing something the world had tried to crucify in secret. And somewhere, beyond that silence, footsteps began to move. Not Brenna's, not the dog's. Something else had heard the silence break. The puppy didn't scream. She didn't even flinch as the second nail tore free from the trunk. Her tiny frame shuddered once, then sagged into Brenna's hands, a bundle of warmth barely holding on. Her pulse trembled beneath skin as thin as crumpled paper. He didn't cradle her like a man holding something precious. He cradled her like something on the edge of death that might vanish if he breathed wrong. Annie approached slowly now, step by halting step, muzzle brushing the pup's head once, then pressing against Brenna's wrist. The old man's jaw tightened. His eyes stung not from age, not from the wind, the kind of sting that came when something buried deep tried to claw its way up through the years. He tucked the pup inside his coat, shielding her body from the cold bite of morning air, and looked once more at the split cedar. The nails remained. One still clutched a smear of pale fur. The blood had soaked into the bark in odd shapes, almost like finger trails. Something was wrong with the silence now. It wasn't just absence, it was restraint. The kind of silence a room holds when someone dangerous is behind the door. Brenna turned in slow circles, the wind pressing harder against his back now. No birds, no rustling. Just the low breath of the forest holding something back. Annie growled low under her breath. Not toward the trail they'd come from, but deeper in, where the trees thickened and the fog clung to the earth like wet skin. A branch snapped in the distance. Not far, not near. Just enough to say, "You're not alone." He didn't wait to investigate. There were times in life where a man had to choose between curiosity and instinct, and Brenna had outlived every fool who chose the former. He moved fast, faster than he thought his legs could carry him, clutching the pup to his chest and urging Annie forward with short, hushed words. The return trail felt longer, darker. The trees leaned closer. Every shadow looked like it knew something. Annie stayed close, though her ears remained pinned and her tail down, not out of fear, but reverence, like she knew they had crossed into something that watched from behind. The veil of the woods. They burst out from the thickets with a gasp of relief, not into Brenner's yard, but into the rear clearing by the rusted irrigation pipes, the long-abandoned plot where nothing ever grew anymore, where the soil was black with memory. He almost didn't see it at first, just a figure standing beside the edge of the clearing. No movement, no reaction. But as the wind shifted, he saw the outline, a man or something that had once been shaped like one, wearing a dark coat too long for its frame, head tilted slightly, as though its neck couldn't quite hold weight. The fog behind it clung to its legs unnaturally. Brenner froze. The pup stirred faintly beneath his coat, letting out a strained whimper. Annie growled louder now, placing herself between Brenner and the figure. Head low, hackles up. She wasn't barking. That was worse. The figure didn't move. Brenner took a single step back, then another. The shape remained, watching or waiting. He turned, pushing past Annie, heading for the gate at the far end of the clearing. His key fumbled in the padlock, cold hands trembling. When it finally snapped open, he didn't look back, not until the heavy creak of the gate gave way to the low tap of something stepping behind them. But there was nothing there. The fog had swallowed the clearing whole. Back inside the house, he bolted the door, drew the old hunting rifle out from the cupboard. Useless or not, it gave him something to believe in, and wrapped the puppy in his wife's old blanket. He laid her on the kitchen table gently. Her breathing was shallow, but present. Her eyes blinked once, and something in them broke him wide open. This wasn't random cruelty. This wasn't a wild animal or a neighborhood psycho acting on impulse. No, this was ritual. Intentional. The nails were too specific. The setting, too silent. The smell of rust and cedar sap clung to his palms like blood that wouldn't wash away. Annie hadn't left her post by the window. She watched the tree line, still growling, still quiet. Brenner cleaned the puppy's wounds with iodine and warm cloth. The smell of infection was faint, but not yet lethal. What haunted him more was her stillness, not the paralysis of pain, the quiet of fear, the kind so deep it teaches even babies not to cry, because crying invites the thing to return. That night, Brenner didn't sleep. The woods didn't either. Somewhere past midnight, Annie began to whine. Short, sharp breaths against the door. Brenner followed her to the porch, rifle in hand, coat thrown over his nightshirt. The moon was swallowed by mist. But in the distance, near the edge of the broken garden fence, something glimmered. A line of nails hammered upright into the soil, 13 of them in perfect silence, and beside them, a second puppy. Crucified the same way, only this one was already dead. Annie howled once, short and strangled. Brenner fell to his knees. The thing in the fog had left a message. They hadn't saved her. They'd interrupted something. Brenner sat there for a long time. The soil beneath his knees was damp, and the weight of what he saw pressed into his bones like the cold. 13 nails, perfectly spaced, upright like gravestones for something that hadn't died yet. The second puppy, another golden, same size, same color, hung limp against a sapling. Whoever had done this hadn't tried to hide it. They'd arranged it, displayed it, like they wanted someone to see, to understand, or maybe to warn. Annie didn't approach the scene. She stayed behind Brenner, her chest vibrating with low stuttered growls. Her eyes kept scanning the woods, not searching, but tracking. She could still feel it out there. Whatever it was, whatever had come through the trees and left a dead body posed in a ritual. Brenner didn't recognize but couldn't stop seeing every time he blinked. He forced himself to stand. His knees cracked under the strain, his back cried out, but he moved with purpose. He lifted the small, lifeless body from the bark and wrapped it in his flannel shirt. It weighed so little. Still warm, not long dead, maybe minutes, maybe even, while he'd been inside trying to save the first. Whoever had done this wasn't watching from afar. They were here. The fog didn't break even as the sun came up. It hung low over the tree line, thick as wool, and carried a strange sweetness now, like decay wrapped in perfume. Brenner buried the second pup in the old garden bed, right beside his wife's rosebush. He didn't mark it with stone. He didn't say a word. But when the last handful of earth fell onto the flannel, he placed one of the 13 nails on top, a single promise. Back inside, the first pup was still breathing. Barely she stirred once when Brenner touched her paw. The swelling around the wounds had worsened. Infection was moving faster than he could clean. She needed a vet, needed proper care. But the nearest clinic was over an hour away, and with fog this thick, he wasn't sure he'd even make it down the road, let alone through the hills. He stared at the little creature on the table, and then at the second nail he'd brought inside, the one he hadn't buried. It was handmade, not factory forged, misshapen, pitted, like something crafted for a purpose beyond utility. And engraved, barely visible, a single mark, a circle with a vertical line through the center. It wasn't a logo. It was older, rough. He knew it from somewhere, but couldn't place it. Brenna lit the fire. Not for warmth, for light, for control. The fog pressed against the windows like a skin trying to enter. Annie hadn't left the doorway since sunrise. Her breathing had changed now, slower, more deliberate, waiting, listening. Her fur was raised, and something about the set of her jaw told Brenna she'd seen this before. He reached for his wife's old books, not the novels, but the leather-bound ones she kept in the cellar. Her notes, her drawings. She had once studied symbols, rituals, folklore. Before the cancer took her mind, she used to say, "The world writes its warnings in the dirt, but nobody reads anymore." Now Brenna read. The symbol matched an old etching tucked between pages about animal sacrifice and warding practices. Not common, not even local. A blend of ancient mountain lore and something else, something that had been imported past, through whispers and backwoods families that never registered land or birth. The mark was called the hinge between worlds. The note beneath it, scrawled in his wife's narrow script, chilled him: crucifixion, used not for death, but as invitation. The blood isn't the message, the suffering is. He looked toward the puppy. She was shivering now, faint tremors that pulsed through the blanket like Morse code. Still no sound, no whine, no cry, just breath and silence. He thought of the other 12 nails, still standing out there, and the 13th, buried. He hadn't stopped the ritual. He'd triggered it. A knock came at the door. Not timid, not rushed. A single knock, slow and deliberate. Annie launched into a snarl so violent her body shook. She rammed her shoulder against the wood, teeth bared, eyes wild. Brenna raised the rifle, walked to the door, didn't open it. Another knock, slower this time, more like pressing. He spoke through the door, voice ragged. "You need to leave." Silence, then a whisper, so faint it seemed to come from inside the house. "You took what wasn't yours." Brenna froze. Another whisper, this time from the back window. "You buried it wrong." He turned, nothing there. Annie barked now, frenzied, slamming her body against the glass. Outside, shapes moved in the fog, not fast, not loud, but purposeful. Circling, the puppy began to convulse. Brenna ran back to the table, scooping her up as foam began to bubble at her mouth. Her eyes rolled, her body stiffened, then flailed. She wasn't dying, she was reacting to what he didn't know, but Annie did. She tore herself from the window, bolted through the house, and leaped onto the table, placing her body over the pup, barking, growling, barking again. Her chest heaved with effort, and as she barked one final time, a burst so violent it sounded like a scream. The convulsions stopped. The pup gasped, then went still. Alive. Annie collapsed beside her. Outside, the fog pulled back. The 13 nails in the clearing were gone, and in their place stood one driven deep into a mound of fresh earth with Brenna's name carved into the head. The name, carved into the nail, hadn't been etched, it had been gouged. Deep, crude strokes that still held the scent of fresh iron and wet bark. Brenna, not just a warning, not just a message, it was a claim. The fog had receded just enough for the morning sun to bleed through the trees, but even with the light, the clearing felt darker than before. Something had changed in the ground itself. The birds hadn't returned. The wind didn't move the leaves. Brenna stared at the mound, the dirt still damp, slightly steaming like breath from a mouth. He didn't move closer. His knees couldn't carry him, and his thoughts were trying to race ahead of his body. His name, his grave, and the thing that had spoken through the walls, not a voice from outside. Something inside the space he lived in, something old enough to know his name and cruel enough to use it. He returned to the house slowly, clutching the rusted nail like a relic. Annie was still on the floor beside the table, her breath labored, her fur damp with sweat. She didn't rise to greet him. She didn't wag her tail. She simply kept one paw draped protectively over the puppy, whose eyes now fluttered open and shut like she was waking from a fever dream. There was a stillness in the room, not of peace, but of aftermath. The kind that settles after a close call, when every nerve is waiting for the second wave. Brenna placed the nail on the mantel, beside the old oil lamp. The circle mark, the hinge, was still faintly visible. The line through the middle now felt less like a symbol and more like a boundary, one that had been crossed. He sat in the armchair across from the pup, watching her chest rise and fall. She was alive, for now, and the fact that she had survived, the crucifixion and the convulsions, the fact that Annie had calmed her with a bark that sounded more like command than comfort, it all pointed to something Brenna didn't want to admit. This wasn't just ritual, it was selective, deliberate. Someone had chosen this land, these dogs. And now, him. Hours passed in a blur. He didn't eat, he didn't rest. He combed through his wife's old books again, tracing every thread related to animal blood rights, nature-bound entities and invocations. A passage tucked in the margins of one page caught his eye. The hinge opens only with suffering offered and witnessed. Once accepted, it follows. It waits until the one who interrupts pays the debt in kind. He read it twice. Then again he hadn't saved the puppy, not in time. One had still died, one had still hung. The suffering had been offered, witnessed. And now the hinge had opened. Brenna looked at Annie, whose eyes met his with more than canine understanding. She was warning him not as a pet, but as a mother, the kind who had already lost one child. and wouldn't lose another without bloodshed. He knew he had hours at most, maybe less. By dusk, the fog had not returned, but the air had grown unnaturally still. No crickets, no rustling, just a strange, low hum beneath the floorboards, as if something massive was vibrating far beneath the earth, pulsing in slow, rhythmic beats. The pup whimpered, not from pain, from memory. Like her body remembered what her mind had tried to forget. She tried to stand and fell back with a soft yelp. Annie nuzzled her, then looked at Brenna with those dark, grieving eyes. He stepped outside. Once more, the rifle slung across his back, a lantern in his hand. The clearing was empty, the nails gone. But now, spread across the soil were footprints, hundreds, small, bare, human-like, but twisted, the toes too long, the arch too deep. They spiraled out from the mound and looped in strange, geometric shapes, as if performing a ritual in reverse. And at the center, where the final nail had stood, there was now a shallow depression. Not a grave, a hole. Brenna moved closer, light trembling in his grip. The hole wasn't deep, maybe 2 feet, but at the bottom was a single object. A collar, the same one Annie had torn off and buried years ago, the one worn by her stillborn pup, the first one they lost, long before this, before the rituals, before the blood. The tag was intact, still bearing the name Brenna's wife had engraved. Elsie. He nearly dropped the lantern. That name had never been spoken beyond their home. They hadn't even told the vet. The pup had died in the womb, a still shadow in the ultrasound. But Annie had carried the collar in her mouth for weeks after, until Brenna buried it one morning before sunrise while his wife wept in the bath. No one could have known that name unless something had been watching then. Too, he picked up the collar slowly, hands trembling. As soon as his fingers wrapped around the tag, the humming stopped. The stillness broke, and from the edge of the woods, just beyond the tree line, dozens of tiny glowing eyes blinked open. Not animals, men. Something in between. The figures didn't move forward. They shifted, barely visible between the trees, heads tilted at unnatural angles, shoulders jerking in small, stuttered motions. And then came the sound. Not a scream, not a growl. A low guttural chant, rising in volume but never changing tone, as if 1,000 tongues were trying to speak without meaning. Brenna backed away, holding the collar like a weapon. The figures did not advance. They only waited. The dead had been named. The name was Brenna's. Brenna didn't run. That would have been foolish. The things in the woods, those half-shapes with glowing eyes and jerking limbs, weren't chasing him. They didn't need to. They had time. They had patience. And more than that, they had his name. Not in the way a man's name appears on a letter, but the way it echoes through soil after he's walked the same path 1,000 times. The land knew him. The nail had merely reminded it. He stepped back into the house with the collar still in hand, fingers closing around the cold metal like a prayer he didn't know how to say. Annie rose slowly, stiff from the long day, but her eyes sharpened at once when she saw the tag. She sniffed the air and whimpered, then circled the pup once, before resting beside her again. The puppy was asleep now, deeper than before, her breath steady, soft, almost normal. There was a word Brenna's wife used to use back when she still scribbled folklore notes into her margins. Threshold. She'd say it quietly, always with care, like it was something holy. A threshold isn't just a place, she once whispered to him by firelight. It's a moment, a sliver of time where a choice has to be made, and once crossed, nothing can be undone. This was that moment. The collar had been dug up for a reason, not to threaten, not to haunt, but to offer the shape of a deal. The earth had watched. It had recorded the loss. The stillborn pup that never opened its eyes. The grief Annie carried for months. The silence between Brenna and his wife that had grown like ivy until it filled the whole house. The pain had gone unanswered, and now something ancient had stepped forward to collect. But not in punishment. In exchange, Brenna moved to the hearth where the nail rested. He set the collar beside it, and for a long time he just stared at the two objects. One was man-made, full of love and memory. The other forged for binding, shaped for cruelty, but used in ritual far older than metal itself. Then he turned to the kitchen table. The puppy was awake now, watching him, not in fear, but in stillness. Her eyes were clearer, as if somehow she already knew what this was. Maybe she remembered the crucifixion, or maybe it had left something in her. Not pain, but a tether. He bent down, kissed her forehead once, and whispered the only word that came, Elsie. She didn't flinch. Outside, the chanting had stopped. The air was holding its breath again. Waiting. Brenna stood tall, 78 years, half-blind and heavier with sorrow than any man had a right to carry. But in that moment, his body, it felt lighter than it had in decades. Not strong, not young, just ready. He opened the front door. Annie didn't follow. She didn't protest. She stayed beside the pup, unmoving but alert. To protect her. The witness. He stepped into the clearing. The fog had returned in spirals now, moving with the wind in slow coils. The mound where the nail had stood was bare, the hole gone. In its place, a small stone circle, ancient and sunken, like it had always been there, waiting just beneath the grass. The figures began to emerge. They didn't step, they slid, without weight, without sound. They formed a loose ring around the stone, still watching, always watching. Brenna walked to the center, placed the collar on the stone. Then, after a long pause, laid the nail beside it. The figures bowed. And the stone lit, not in flame, not in light, but in memory. He saw flashes then, not with his eyes, but with something deeper. His wife in the garden, placing seeds in the dirt. Annie curled beside the bed as thunder rolled outside. The first time she brought him her newborn pups, tail wagging gently, eyes proud, and the one that never opened its eyes, the tiny body he buried alone, while pretending he was strong enough not to cry. Then came the whisper, not from the woods, from the stone itself. Det witnessed. Pain returned. Hinge closed. The figures began to dissolve, curling backward into the trees like shadows returning to the roots. The fog broke like a curtain, and in the clearing, only Brenna remained. He didn't feel afraid. He felt complete. When he returned to the house, the lantern flickered low. The fire was dying. Annie lifted her head, tail thumping once in relief. The puppy stood on trembling legs and walked. To him, not limping, not broken. She sat beside his boots and looked up, waiting. He picked her up, cradled her against his chest, and sat in the old chair beside the hearth. Annie rested at his feet. The wind moved through the eaves again. The birds returned to the trees. And, for the first time in days, there was nothing watching from the woods. That night, Brenna slept in the chair, the puppy curled against his chest. His last thought before sleep wasn't about fear, or loss, or even death. It was about forgiveness, because sometimes the earth remembers our grief more than we do. And when we are brave enough to face it, when we name it and offer it back to the silence, something ancient listens. And sometimes, it lets us go.